Hello, my name is Adia Smith, and this is my presentation on laws prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation. First, let's talk about Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act prohibits employee discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. I would like to discuss the Equality Act. This is a bill that was sent to Congress. If passed, would allow for an amendment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Equality Act prohibits discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity in employment, housing, public accommodations, education, federally funded programs, credit, and jury service. Similar bills have been proposed since the 1970s. The most recent edition of the Equality Act was proposed first in the 114th United States Congress, but ultimately ignored. This act was reintroduced on February 18, 2021 in the 117th Congress. The House passed the act on February 25th. The bill has since then been moved to the Senate for further consideration. Next, I would like to discuss the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. ENDA is a proposed legislature in Congress that would prohibit discrimination within the hiring and employment process based on sexual orientation, gender identity, by employers with at least 15 employees. ENDA has been introduced to Congress since 1994. Similar legislation has been introduced without passage since 1974. Exceptions include religious organizations, membership-only clubs, some labor unions. Next, I'd like to discuss other forms of non-discrimination laws. First being public accommodation non-discrimination laws. These laws protect LGBTQ+ individuals from being unfairly refused service, denied entry to, or otherwise discriminated against in public spaces based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. Usually, these laws cover for public spaces someone is in when they are not at work, home, or in school. Such spaces as retail stores, restaurants, parks, hotels, doctor's offices, and banks. Another form is housing non-discrimination laws, which also protect LGBTQ+ individuals from being treated unfairly based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, such as unfairly evicted, denied housing, or refused the ability to rent or buy a house. Last, I'll talk about the credit and lending non-discrimination laws. These protect LGBTQ+ individuals from being unfairly denied credit and lending services. Such services include opening bank accounts, taking out loans, and etc. Next, I'd like to further discuss a few of these non-discrimination laws as they pertain to the United States and U.S. territories. We notice on this map that we have from Movement Advancement Project that of states with laws explicitly prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, there are 21 U.S. states as well as D.C. We also are able to see that of states that explicitly interprets existing prohibitions on sex discrimination to also include sexual orientation and or gender identity, we have 7 states. We see that with states with laws explicitly prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation only, and that is only 1 state. And we see of these states that do not have explicit prohibitions or for discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in state law, we have 21 states and 5 U.S. territories. Now we can review the maps for non-discrimination laws regarding housing among the U.S. states and U.S. territories. We see that state laws that explicitly prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity can be found in 22 states, as well as D.C. For states that explicitly interprets existing prohibitions on sex discrimination to also include sexual orientation and/or gender identity, we have 9 states total. However, for state laws that explicitly prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation only, again, we only have 1 state. And lastly, states with no explicit prohibitions for discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, we have 18 states, and again, all 5 U.S. territories. Now I'd like to discuss credit and lending non-discrimination laws. Again, using the map provided by Movement Advancement Project, we're able to see that there are 15 states, as well as DC, that explicitly have laws prohibiting discrimination in credit based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We're also able to tell that there are 3 states that explicitly interprets existing prohibitions on sex discrimination to include sexual orientation and/or gender identity. With this map, we're able to see that there are 0 states that explicitly prohibit discrimination in credit based on sexual orientation only. And lastly, we're able to see that there are 35 states and all 5 territories that have no explicit prohibitions for discrimination in credit based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Next, I'd like to move on and discuss a couple court cases that influenced these laws. First case I'd like to discuss is the 2015 case of Overfell versus Hodgins. Within this case, the key questions being reviewed were 1, whether the 14th Amendment requires that states issue licenses for same-sex couples to marry, and the second question was whether the 14th Amendment requires that states recognize same-sex marriages are legitimate if they were lawfully performed out of state. Within this case, the holdings revealed the U.S. Constitution's Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment requires the states to license a marriage between 2 people of the same sex, as well as to recognize the legitimacy of marriage between 2 people of the same sex when their marriage was lawfully licensed and performed out of state. Section 2 of the Defense of the Marriage Act is unconstitutional. The final case I'd like to discuss is Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, 2020. In this case, the employer fired a county employee for unbecoming conduct after the employee began participating in a gay recreational softball league. With this case, Justice Gorsuch released a statement saying, "Today, we must decide whether an employer can fire someone simply for being homosexual or transgender. The answer is clear. An employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions that would not have been questioned in members of a different sex. Sex plays a necessary and undisguisable role in the decision, exactly what Title VII forbids." This case resulted in a majority vote with Justice Gorsuch, Chief Justice John Roberts, and the court's 4 liberal justices ruling that it is unlawful under federal law for employers to discriminate against employees based on sexual orientation or gender identity. The court held that legislative intent or conventional use of the term sex in 1964 is irrelevant where the text itself is unambiguous and the result certain when applied to the facts. Next, I'd like to look at the impacts of Georgia, specifically these non-discrimination laws. Within the state of Georgia, when looking at sexual orientation, we're able to tell that 12% of the population is fully protected. Meanwhile, less than 1% of the population is only partially protected. And we're able to get this map from the Movement Advancement Project. Based on the legend, we're able to tell that majority of the state of Georgia does not have protections for sexual orientation. Next, as we look at gender identity, we're able to tell that 12% of the population is fully protected. Meanwhile, 0% of the population is only partially protected. And again, based off of the legend, we're able to tell that majority of the populations in Georgia and the counties in Georgia do not have any protections. Of the counties and cities mentioned previously, we're able to assess, based off of this table given to us by the Movement Advancement Project, we're able to assess of those counties or cities which have fully inclusive sexual orientation or gender identity protections, as well as which have local sexual orientation protections relating to employment, housing, and public accommodations. And lastly, of those cities and counties which have local gender identity protections, as it also relates to employment, housing, and public accommodations. This concludes my presentation. If you have any further questions or comments, please reach out to me and I will be more than happy to assist. On the next page, I'll be discussing my sources. These are the sources that can be found. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.